They left Pearl Harbor in December 1941, believing they carried the most advanced torpedo in the world, a weapon polished by decades of peacetime development and backed by the absolute confidence of the Bureau of Ordnance. The Mark 14, they were told, would run true, hit hard, and devastate with devastating force beneath the keels of Japanese ships. But as the first American submarines slipped into the waters around the Philippines, Formosa, and the South China Sea, that confidence shattered, dive by dive, patrol by patrol, until the silent service, America's only weapon capable of striking Japan's maritime lifelines in the dark months after Pearl Harbor, found itself armed with a torpedo that rarely worked as designed. The early patrols should have been moments of triumph. Commanders like Tyrell Jacobs of USS Sargo, Dudley Mush Morton of USS Wahoo, and John Wilkes of Submarine Force Asia identified Japanese transports, tankers, and even warships presenting perfect firing angles. Solutions were calculated, spreads were launched, and crews waited for the rising columns of water that should have marked a successful hit. Instead, again and again, nothing happened. Torpedoes passed cleanly under targets. Others detonated prematurely, erupting in white geysers hundreds of yards short of the enemy. Some struck their targets with a metallic thud and simply failed to explode. Japanese merchant ships sailed on unharmed, while American captains cursed, disbelieving that so many perfect attacks could turn into failures. Reports poured into Pacific Fleet headquarters from Manila, Fremantle, and Pearl Harbor. Commanders claimed that the Mark 14 was running too deep, that its magnetic exploder was firing prematurely, that its contact detonator was unreliable. The Bureau of Ordnance dismissed each complaint. Officers in Washington insisted that the weapon had been thoroughly tested, that the captains were misjudging angles, that the seas were confusing sonar readings. But at the front, men who staked their lives on those torpedoes knew something was terribly wrong. The failures were not occasional, they were systemic. The crisis reached absurd levels. In one instance, USS Tenosa fired 15 torpedoes at the Japanese tanker Tanan-Maru Memo 3. 12 struck, but did not explode. The remaining shots ran under the target or detonated early. The massive ship, hit repeatedly by duds, escaped. In another patrol, USS Sea Dragon fired at a Japanese destroyer, only to watch torpedoes pass harmlessly beneath the keel. The problem was not the skill of the captains, it was the weapon itself. But in the early months of the war, American submarine skippers shouldered the blame. Some were reprimanded for poor fire discipline. Others were told to adjust their methods or improve their firing accuracy. Meanwhile, Japan continued expanding across the Pacific, supported by a vast merchant fleet that carried oil from the Dutch East Indies, iron ore from Manchuria, and troops throughout its growing empire. American submarines were supposed to sever those arteries. Instead, they were unable to deliver decisive blows. By late 1942, the silent service was in a crisis no one wanted to admit. Torpedo failures cost the United States opportunities to destroy troop convoys, supply ships, and even capital vessels. At a time when American surface forces were reeling from the losses at Coral Sea and Guadalcanal, submarines should have been the spear tip of strategic interdiction. Instead, they were firing weapons that betrayed them. Yet within this frustration lay a growing determination. Submarine commanders began keeping detailed logs of every failure. They tracked torpedo depth, angles, target silhouettes, sea conditions, and detonation, or lack thereof. Commander Charles Lockwood, soon to become ComSubPac, started collecting testimony and investigating reports personally. He listened when others dismissed. He believed his skippers when Washington did not. And slowly, through pattern after pattern, failure after failure, the truth began to emerge. The Mark 14 was not just flawed. It was catastrophically flawed in multiple ways. The early submarine war had become a struggle not only against the Japanese Empire, but against the very weapon the United States expected to fight with. And until that weapon was fixed, American submarines would continue to fail in the one mission that mattered most, choking Japan's maritime lifelines before the war could turn irreversibly against the Allies.
The men who fought beneath the Pacific had long suspected that something was fundamentally wrong with the Mark 14. But it was only through repeated failures, documented meticulously by frustrated submarine commanders, that the pattern of disaster became undeniable. What emerged was not a single defect or a minor calibration issue, but 3 catastrophic design flaws, each sufficient on its own to cripple a torpedo's combat effectiveness. Together, they rendered the Mark 14 arguably the worst primary weapon issued to any major navy at the outset of World War II. The first flaw was deep running. Submarine captains noticed early that attacks set for a shallow depth consistently passed beneath enemy ships. Depth gauges on American submarines showed the torpedoes running at the correct settings, yet the results in combat told a different story. USS Sargo, USS Tautog, and USS Sea Dragon all reported torpedoes running far deeper than intended. But it wasn't until 1942-43 when torpedoes were deliberately fired into cliff faces or sandbanks during unauthorized tests that the truth was proven beyond dispute. Torpedoes set to run at 10 feet were striking at depths of 18, 20, even 25 feet, so low they passed under destroyers, cruisers, and most merchant ships. The Bureau of Ordnance had conducted years of peacetime tests using torpedoes stripped of warheads, their buoyancy altered by missing explosive weight, causing them to run shallower than they would in battle. In other words, the Mark 14 had never actually been tested at realistic combat weight before the war began. The second flaw was even more insidious, the faulty magnetic exploder, the Mark 6. In theory, the magnetic detonator was a technological marvel, a device that sensed the magnetic field of a ship's keel and triggered a devastating underbelly explosion. In reality, it was a disaster. The Earth's magnetic fields varied widely across the Pacific, causing the Mark 6 exploder to behave erratically. Torpedoes often detonated prematurely, sometimes hundreds of yards short of the target, producing the infamous white geysers that alerted convoys and ruined surprise. Other times, the magnetic exploder failed to activate altogether, letting perfect shots glide silently beneath enemy ships and vanish into the depths. Submarine commanders begged Pacific Fleet leadership to disable the magnetic exploder, but the Bureau of Ordnance insisted the device was flawless. They claimed the premature detonations were caused by, quote, skippers firing too close, unquote, even though wartime engagements often required close-range shots for accuracy. The third and final flaw was perhaps the most shocking. The contact exploder, designed to detonate when the torpedo physically struck a ship, was too weak to survive direct impact at high speed. This defect produced the most humiliating failures of the war, torpedoes that hit enemy ships with a loud metallic clang and simply bounced off, sinking uselessly into the ocean. The problem stemmed from a design decision made years earlier. The firing pin mechanism was positioned in such a way that a head-on impact jammed the firing pin instead of driving it forward. Ironically, the more perfect the shot, the more direct and perpendicular the impact, the more likely the detonator was to fail completely. USS Tenosa's infamous engagement in July 1943 proved this beyond argument. After firing multiple torpedoes into Tonin Maru No. 3, a massive 19,000-ton tanker, only one exploded. The rest hit squarely, leaving deep dents in the hull but no detonations. The tanker survived. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit, returned to Pearl Harbor furious. He demanded an investigation. For the first time, a dud torpedo was recovered and examined. The firing pin had bent upon impact. That discovery broke open the entire controversy. Lockwood and his staff now understood something devastating. American submarines had been sent to war with torpedoes that ran too deep, detonated early, or failed to detonate at all, and they had been using them for nearly 2 years. The situation was almost unbelievable. The silent service, tasked with strangling Japan's shipping, had been firing weapons that succeeded less often than they failed. Early in the war, Japanese shipping losses were far lower than American strategy required, not because U.S. submarines failed to find targets, but because their torpedoes failed to function. The toll of missed opportunities was enormous. Troop transports that should have been sunk, tankers that should have burned, warships that should have been crippled. Each failure allowed Japan to sustain its war machine longer. Each dud prolonged the conflict, and each defect deepened the anger within the submarine force. By 1943, the truth could no longer be ignored. The Mark 14 was not suffering from a single malfunction. It was catastrophically broken in nearly every critical function. The question now was simple. Would the Navy fix it in time to make American submarines the decisive weapon they were meant to be?
By early 1943, the frustration within the American submarine force had reached a breaking point. Patrol reports were filled with identical complaints: torpedoes running under targets, exploding prematurely, or failing to explode at all. Yet the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington continued to insist that the Mark 14 was fundamentally sound. According to the officials who had overseen its development, any failures must have been caused by poor marksmanship, incorrect firing angles, or faulty observations from the field. But the men who actually fought beneath the waves knew better. Their lives depended on these torpedoes. The future of the Pacific War depended on them, and they were no longer willing to accept excuses from offices thousands of miles away. The turning point came under the leadership of Rear Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, who assumed command of Submarine Force Pacific, COM Subpac. Unlike the Bureau of Ordnance, Lockwood trusted his skippers. He read their reports closely, compared their findings, and recognized the unmistakable consistency of the failures. Lockwood famously declared, "If the Mark 14 torpedo is the best torpedo in the world, then we have the Japanese Navy right where we want them, at the bottom of the ocean laughing at us." His sarcasm masked a strategic crisis. Unless the torpedoes were fixed, the entire submarine campaign, the core of America's long-term plan to strangle Japanese logistics, was doomed. The Bureau of Ordnance still refused to authorize proper testing with live warheads. They insisted the torpedo had already been proven in pre-war trials. But those trials, as submarine officers increasingly realized, had been conducted under unrealistic conditions. Torpedoes had been fired without warheads, into nets, or in controlled trials that avoided true impact stress. None of the tests had revealed the hidden flaws now costing submarine crews victory after victory. So Lockwood and his commanders decided to act. They would test the torpedoes themselves, even if doing so meant disregarding official directives. In the spring and summer of 1943, American submarines began firing Mark 14s into the coral cliffs near Kahalawe and into steel test plates to measure depth performance and detonator reliability. What they found was infuriating, undeniable, and catastrophic. 1. The torpedoes were running too deep, as much as 10 to 15 feet deeper than their settings indicated. 2. The magnetic exploders were wildly unreliable, often detonating early due to the Earth's magnetic variations. 3. The contact exploders failed on direct hits, their firing pins bending or shattering rather than initiating detonation. The data proved every complaint submarine captains had made since 1941. In June 1943, Lockwood took decisive action. He ordered the magnetic exploder disabled across the entire Pacific submarine fleet. This single directive transformed Mark 14 performance almost overnight, eliminating premature detonations. But a deeper problem remained. Contact exploders still failed regularly, especially on perfect 90-degree impact angles. In some situations, submarine commanders deliberately aimed for oblique shots, an absurd tactic, because straight hits were more likely to result in duds. Lockwood was determined to uncover the full truth. He oversaw a series of explosive trials using recovered dud torpedoes. When the firing pin mechanism was examined post-impact, engineers watched the metal deform under stress, proof that the detonation system was fundamentally flawed. Only after these tests did the Bureau of Ordnance reluctantly admit that the Mark 14's contact exploder needed redesign. With pressure from ComSubPac, the firing pin assembly was modified to withstand high-speed impact, and by late 1943 the new design was rolled out across the fleet. The moment of vindication came in the form of raw numbers. Submarine sinkings began to rise, first gradually, then explosively. Commanders who had once returned home with logbooks full of failed attacks were now sinking Japanese ships at a pace that stunned naval intelligence. It was not the submarine captains who had been failing. It was the weapon they had been forced to use, and now that weapon was finally behaving as intended. This revolt of the skippers was one of the most significant turning points in the Pacific War. It was a rebellion not of disobedience, but of necessity. Experienced officers defying bureaucracy to save their crews, their mission, and their country. After nearly 2 years of firing torpedoes that betrayed them, American submariners finally possessed a weapon worthy of their courage and skill. The silent service had broken free from the technical shackles that had crippled it since Pearl Harbor. Now the question was no longer whether U.S. submarines could be effective. It was how devastating they would become once their primary weapon actually worked.
When the Mark 14 torpedo finally began functioning as intended, running at proper depth, detonating reliably on contact, and freed from its disastrous magnetic exploder, American submarines underwent one of the most dramatic transformations of any combat arm in the Second World War. Almost overnight, the silent service shifted from a force plagued by missed opportunities and humiliating failures into the deadliest anti-shipping weapon Japan had ever faced. The effect was immediate, measurable, and overwhelming. In 1942, despite extraordinary bravery and aggressive tactics, U.S. submarines had sunk far fewer ships than American strategy required. But in mid to late 1943, as corrected torpedoes reached the fleet, the results changed with breathtaking speed. Submarine patrols returning to Pearl Harbor, Midway, and Fremantle carried logbooks filled not with excuses or dud reports, but with confirmed kills. Tankers, freighters, troopships, even warships being sent to the bottom at a pace that stunned intelligence analysts. Commanders who had once doubted their own abilities now learned what they had suspected all along. Their tactics were sound. It had been their weapons that betrayed them. Meanwhile, Japan, already stretched thin, could not afford the losses. The empire's war machine depended almost entirely on merchant shipping. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, bauxite from the Philippines, coal from Hokkaido, food from Korea and China, every resource critical to Japanese survival moved by sea. Once American submarines finally had a reliable torpedo, every one of those routes became a battlefield. The list of submarine aces who emerged in 1943 and 1944 reads like a roll call of naval legends. Commander Dudley Mush Morton and his ace executive officer Dick O'Kane aboard USS Wahoo pioneered aggressive surface attacks at night, slipping into convoys, firing spreads at point-blank range, and weaving through escorts before diving to escape. Wahoo's streak of sinkings in 1943 electrified the submarine force and inspired younger skippers to adopt similar bold tactics. O'Kane later took command of USS Tang, which became one of the most successful submarines in U.S. naval history. Commander Eugene Fluckey of USS Barb pushed submarine warfare to new extremes, making high-speed end-around attacks, infiltrating shallow harbors, and launching daring missions onto Japanese shores. His crew destroyed trains, sank multiple convoys, and won the Medal of Honor for an attack on an escorted convoy inside Namquan Harbor, one of the most audacious submarine operations ever conducted. Commander Sam Dealey of USS Harder specialized in hunting Japanese destroyers, arguably the most dangerous of all submarine prey, and sank 5 in under a week, crippling Japanese anti-submarine efforts during the critical months of 1944. Each of these men, and dozens of others, wielded the corrected Mark 14 as it had always been intended, a silent, lethal spear capable of sinking Japan's lifeblood from beneath the waves. Japanese vulnerabilities compounded the effect. Unlike the Allies in the Atlantic, Japan did not build an extensive convoy system until it was already too late. Its escort fleet was small, its sonar outdated, and its anti-submarine doctrine weak. Merchant captains sailed independently, often without zigzag patterns, convinced that Japan's early war successes meant they controlled the seas. American commanders exploited these weaknesses with ruthless efficiency. The introduction of SJ surface search radar allowed submarines to detect convoys at night or in heavy weather, enabling end-around maneuvers where a submarine surfaced, sprinted ahead of its target, and set up a perfect ambush. The ability to combine radar tracking with a reliable torpedo was decisive. What once produced frustration now yielded results with surgical precision. Convoys that had shrugged off dozens of dud torpedoes in 1942 were now being annihilated. Entire routes, such as the vital oil lanes from Balikpapan and Palembang, became graveyards of sunken freighters. The numbers are staggering. In 1942, Japanese shipping losses were painful but manageable. In 1943, they became severe. But in 1944, after the Mark 14's defects were fully corrected, U.S. submarines sank Japanese ships at a rate the Imperial Navy could not possibly replace. Tankers vanished, weapons transports never arrived, troops drowned by the thousands. Japanese merchant fleet, which had started the war at over 6 million tons, fell below 3 million by early 1944 and plunging further each month. By the end of that year, American submarines had severed nearly every artery feeding the Japanese war economy. What changed the war was not simply that U.S. submarines became more aggressive. They had always been aggressive. What changed was that their weapons finally worked. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, submarine commanders could rely on their torpedoes to strike as intended. And once that happened, the silent service became the most consistently lethal arm of the U.S. Navy. The torpedo that had once embarrassed them was now their most powerful asset, and Japan was beginning to feel the consequences, not slowly, but with accelerating, catastrophic force.
By the beginning of 1944, the correction of the Mark 14 torpedo had transformed the American submarine force from a frustrated, underperforming branch of the Navy into the single most destructive weapon employed against the Japanese Empire. The shift was so dramatic, so sweeping, that historians still regard it as one of the greatest operational turnarounds of the entire war. After 2 years of dud torpedoes, missed kills, and squandered opportunities, the silent service was finally able to unleash its full potential, and the effect was nothing short of catastrophic for Japan. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Between 1943 and 1945, American submarines were responsible for sinking approximately 55% of all Japanese ships lost in the war, including not only merchant vessels, but also destroyers, cruisers, and even aircraft carriers. They sank more tonnage than the U.S. Navy's surface fleet and carrier aircraft combined. These achievements cannot be separated from the technical corrections of the Mark 14. Once the torpedo ran at proper depth, detonated reliably upon impact, and no longer suffered premature explosions from its magnetic trigger, American submariners gained something they had not possessed at any point earlier in the war: predictability. A firing solution now meant something. A hit meant destruction. And with that reliability came a level of strategic lethality unmatched by any other force in the Pacific. Japan's economy, already strained by years of expensive campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, depended almost entirely on imported resources. The empire produced barely a fraction of its own oil, and the bulk of its industrial materials, rubber, iron ore, bauxite, nickel, copper, had to be transported across thousands of miles of ocean. Once functioning torpedoes allowed American submarines to target those shipping routes with confidence, the collapse was inevitable. In 1944 alone, U.S. submarines sank over 1.7 million tons of Japanese shipping, obliterating the convoy lanes between the Dutch East Indies and the home islands. Tankers carrying vital oil were the first targets, and their destruction plunged Japan into a fuel crisis so severe that by late 1944, the Imperial Navy could not even train pilots, let alone conduct major fleet operations. Battleships sat idle. Aircraft carriers, though repaired, could not sortie with full air groups. Destroyers lacked the fuel needed to escort convoys. Entire fleet units were confined to port, slowly starving for the oil that once flowed freely from the south. The destruction of the merchant fleet had even broader consequences. Japan's army in China, Burma, and the Pacific Islands was immobilized. Supplies dwindled, soldiers starved, reinforcements never arrived. In some garrisons, troops were reduced to eating roots, bark, and grass. American submarines had become the instrument of a silent famine, an attritional strangulation that undermined Japan's ability to fight long before B-29s ever appeared over Tokyo. Yet the devastation was not only logistical, it was psychological. Convoys that once sailed confidently in loose formation now huddled behind inadequate escort screens, zigzagging desperately to evade radar-equipped submarines that hunted by night and day. Merchant crews lived in constant fear of periscope wakes or the sudden streak of a torpedo. Japanese morale plummeted as ship after ship disappeared without warning. Even Japan's industrial planners eventually admitted that the war was lost long before the first atomic bomb fell. Lost because the nation's maritime arteries had been cut by American submarines wielding the now lethal Mark 14. By 1945, Japan's merchant fleet had been reduced from nearly 6 million tons to barely 1.5 million, much of it non-operational. The country's oil reserves were so depleted that naval training flights ceased almost entirely. When the combined fleet attempted its final sortie, Operation Tengo, the doomed run of battleship Yamata, it sailed with just enough fuel for a one-way trip. This collapse was not the work of some vast surface fleet or decisive carrier battle. It was the work of fewer than 300 American submarines, operating far from support, armed with torpedoes that finally performed as intended. The strategic impact is unmistakable. The correction of the Mark 14 torpedo turned the submarine force into the sharpened edge of America's maritime strategy. Without these fixes, the submarine campaign would have remained a tragic, ineffective note-night. With them, it became the war-winning instrument that shattered Japan's lifelines and accelerated the empire's downfall. What began in frustration and failure, in duds, premature detonations, and torpedoes running too deep, ended in a campaign of precision destruction unmatched in modern naval history. In the end, the Silent Service did not simply harass Japanese shipping, it destroyed it, and in doing so, it helped bring an entire empire to its knees.